On this video, I'm going to talk about what few people tell digital nomads. Now, before watching this video, check out infuriated.com, especially if you're an expat or a high net worth individual. Now, on this video, I'm going to talk about digital nomads. What do few people tell digital nomads? Now, a digital nomad can be a business owner, but it's usually somebody who's not, maybe they're an individual proprietor or they're working for a tech company. Now, I'm going to start with number one, and that's that it's a changing landscape. What do I mean by that? A couple of decades ago, hardly anyone could work anywhere in the world. Some people could, but you usually had to be very rich. Or, for example, a retiree. A retiree has always been location independent. It might have been a bit more difficult maybe as a 70-year-old to move around the world compared to, let's say, if you're very rich, but retirees have been going overseas for many years, and it's usually relatively easy for them to live overseas and move countries if they're not satisfied and so on and so forth. But these days, there's more and more people becoming digital nomads. So that means the governments are more likely to actually look at the rules and ensure there's compliance when it comes to the rules, because it's becoming a higher number of people. Now, that means you should get compliant. And what's the best way of getting compliant? Now, you should have some kind of tax residency. So this idea that, oh, I'm working around the world, so I don't pay any taxes, that's not necessarily the case. I'll give you an example. Let's say if you're from the UK, and the UK's got a relatively laissez-faire attitude compared to some other countries, and you're spending 3 months here, 3 months here, 3 months here, 3 months here, let's say 4 countries around the world. Some of those countries might say, well, if you're working from home, technically you have established an office here, so you have to pay some taxes there. Now, most countries aren't that strict, and yes, it is true that most countries like Thailand and others aren't necessarily getting tough with enforcement, but you can't rely on that forever. So usually the best way to actually get compliant is to get a tax residency somewhere. Make sure you get a tax residency with a tax number somewhere, even if it's in a jurisdiction that doesn't charge any tax or is low tax, and that would be perfect, right? So for example, if you've got a digital nomad who, for example, moves to Thailand, they get a tax number, they get a visa. Thailand legally doesn't charge income tax on overseas income. You spend most of your time in Thailand, but you spend a little bit amount of time in other countries. That is usually fine, and that's a compliant way you can pay, in some cases, 0% tax. In comparison, if you spend 6 months of the year in Thailand on a tourist visa or another kind of visa, you never know when, essentially things could change. And that's not just the case with Thailand. I could have used Mexico and many countries around the world. So what I would do is get residency in a country which has 0% taxes or low taxes, or a country which has 0% taxes on overseas income. That's countries that have a territorial tax system. That's step one. Step two, I would actually pay some money to be compliant. So nobody likes to pay lawyers and accountants, but if you pay a lawyer and accountant, say $1,000 or whatever, it sounds like a lot of money for a lot of people, and it isn't a small amount of money for most people. Having said that, if you pay that money, that's giving you some satisfaction or some peace of mind that what you're doing is compliant. And if the rules ever change, also you've got some kind of written documentation that you can show that you were trying to comply with the laws. So I would say it's always better to be ahead of the game, because in the same way that governments are going after the multinationals and going after digital taxes, as this kind of thing gets bigger and bigger and bigger, I do think governments are going to get stricter, and it's already happened. So for example, in Australia and Canada, now many expats have to show quote unquote intent. What intent means is if you're an Australian person going overseas, you should cancel your gym membership, you should sell your car, you should really show that yes, you are leaving the country for many years, you don't plan to come back anytime soon. And if you don't do that, the Australian tax authorities are in some cases going after expats, saying, well, no, actually, we think you are still a tax resident in Australia. You might have not spent any time here for 1 or 2 years, but you've still got your gym membership open, or you're still doing this or that. So really look into these things. Make sure you're compliant. Don't rely on thinking, oh, well, I'm only making 50 grand a year or 100 grand a year. The tax authorities are only going to go after people making millions or billion-dollar companies. Get compliant. And that kind of brings me on to another point, and that's that if you want to open up an investment account, usually now you need a tax identification number, that's a TIN. Now, some countries don't have TINs, like Saudi Arabia or Monaco or whatever. And that's fine. If you've got a proof of address for the UAE and you want to open up an investment account, you can legally say, well, I don't have a TIN in the UAE because by definition, they don't have tax numbers. But most countries have tax numbers. And if you do something like you set up an investment account in your home country, that can always cause problems later on. So for example, let's get back to the Australia example. Let's say if you use an Australian brokerage company or bank to do your stocks and shares trading because you've still got a proof of address in Australia. The Australian tax authorities later on could say something like, well, hold on a minute. If this person's still mainly trading in their Australian brokerage account, they're not showing intent. They're merely living overseas for a few years, but they're using services in Australia, albeit online brokerage services. So clearly they're still an Australian tax resident, in which case, why haven't they informed their brokerage that they're now living overseas with a new tax number? So when it comes to investments as well, it's a big risk and something you shouldn't do. And that's using your proof of address, like your bank statement, to set up an account with a brokerage in your home country. It's better you don't do that. When you move overseas, it's better if everything like banking and other things like that are done overseas as well, so that you're actually showing intent. So the bottom line is, when it comes to the nomad market, I would get compliant. I would make sure you know the rules, even the intricacies like showing intent or whatever. And this is going to become more important because I think as governments need revenue around the world, they're going to get stricter on this. How can I help you? In two ways. First of all, are you an expat, a high net wealth individual, or just somebody who lives in a part of the world where it's difficult to get access to quality investment solutions? In which case, go onto my website on adamfayed.com and find out more. If you don't fit into any of those categories, then in which case there's a range of free material on my website, on this YouTube channel, and indeed on my Quora, where I get over 200 or have received over 231 million views in the last few years. And finally, if you want to actually read my thoughts in more detail, go onto Amazon and find my book on there.